Today's discussion is going to focus around the automotive sector within the UK and the wider organisational structures in Europe. It's part of the Evolve UK initiative run by Enterprise Ireland, and we will be focusing on 4 of the main global vehicle manufacturers within the UK and how their operations work in Europe: Volkswagen, Jaguar Land Rover, Nissan Renault and Mercedes. Welcome from Enterprise Ireland, Ian Henry from Auto Analysis. Taking into account the electrification, autonomy, falling demand, trade issues surrounding Brexit, trade disputes, US and China, who would want to run a car company in the UK?
Well, the car industry as a whole has had a consistent, successful production line of its own, if you like, in terms of producing managers of global enterprises. And a lot of the people who go into management in the car industry certainly want to make their mark on the industry and make a career for themselves. And I think the industry presents a huge number of challenges, but that's what a lot of people want to face up to and to deal with. In many cases, if you look at people like Carlos Ghosn, the controversial former head of Renault Nissan, who's transformed that company, and now Carlos Tavares at Peugeot, these are people with ambition who want to achieve things, and whether you agree with everything they've done or are doing, they certainly have made their mark on the industry.
Turning to Brexit, it's gone a little bit quiet because it was all Brexit last year. How do you currently see this affecting the UK vehicle manufacturing industry today?
Well, at the moment, the UK vehicle manufacturers are, if you like, in something of a holding pattern, because we're in the transition period and they are waiting to see what the new trade deal may or may not involve from the beginning of next year. So they're carrying on as now within the single market, within the customs union, with full regulatory alignment with the EU. By the middle of the year, we will see whether the trade deal is likely to be agreed or not, and if there is a breakdown in negotiations between the EU and the UK, then the industry and the countries will have to prepare for a no trade deal arrangement in January. But at the moment, the industry is sitting back and waiting.
Do you think any of the car companies will end up pulling out of manufacturing in the UK?
Well, again, that will depend on the nature of the trade deal. The most vulnerable operation in the UK currently is widely held to be the Vauxhall plant at Ellesmere Port. The vehicle made there, the Astra, runs until sometime in 2021. We would have thought by now that Peugeot would have committed or not committed to the factory. They have said they will wait until the outcome of the trade negotiations has become clear before making that decision, and they will, if necessary, delay making that decision. But how much longer they can delay it, I don't know. As for other car companies, I think, again, because the car industry works on long-term plans and cycles, and model cycles last up to 7 years, I don't think you'll see a sudden series of disinvestments from the UK, but longer term, you may do, depending on the nature of the trade deal.
A lot of conversation around trade deals, Brexit, world trade deals. Can you keep a viable automotive manufacturing sector still operating and performing and manufacturing under WTO terms?
I don't think so, really, because tariffs would be too high. So that's really why the EU and the UK talk about a zero tariff arrangement going forward. Probably the industry could survive for a year or two with the 10% tariff that has been spoken about, but I think they'll want to do everything, or the governments want to do everything they can to avoid that. With the US, it's slightly different because the US actually only charges 2.5% import duty on cars made outside the US. So actually, the US is a slightly better market for the EU than the EU is for the US, ironically.
And what about the broader issues in world trade affecting auto production? Do WTO terms affect production much?
Well, if you're talking about component supply, then because the industry as a whole uses components from all around the world, UK and European vehicle companies who import parts from outside of the EU will currently be paying anything between 2.5 and 4.5% on tariffs on parts coming in from, say, China or Japan or the US. Within the EU, you don't pay that. The UK may have to face up to tariffs being charged on parts it exports to the EU after the trade deal is finally agreed or not. There's a lot of variables here that we still don't know what the answers are going to be.
Speaking of variables, we've touched on Brexit and we've touched on WTO, World Trade, coronavirus. Here we are in early March. There's a lot of concerns around the supply chain in the automotive sector. How will that be affected going forward?
Well, the initial concern was really focused on the parts that are sourced out of China. And we saw some disruption to Hyundai in Korea and a couple of Nissan lines in Japan. A little bit of talk about one of the Fiat factories in Europe which sourced radios out of China being affected. Jaguar Land Rover the other week was reporting it was having to ship key fobs out of China in suitcases in order to maintain production lines. Now the situation is really focused on how supply chains could be disrupted within Europe. We've got the economic lockdown beginning in Italy, and there were some signs of that impacting both Fiat and other car companies a couple of weeks ago, really now, when it first started, because there was a fuse box supplier right inside the initial quarantine zone that was impacted. There are other oddities. For example, we know that there are some headliner suppliers, where headline supply comes into the UK for one or two car companies from southern Italy, and that could be severely affected. And there are other specialist parts that are sourced in Italy by Audi and BMW. This could become a very, very serious issue, and it could be that the same shutdown issue will occur elsewhere in Europe, which will affect other countries in the same way, and that could have a very negative effect. Hopefully we won't get to that, but we just don't know.
So there's been a lot of talk over the last 2 or 3 years about reshoring some of the supply chain back into the UK. 38 to 42% content, for example. From what you're telling me here, it's quite difficult to try and split out the content. It's not necessarily transplanting one source of supply for another.
No, it isn't. And I think first of all, we have to bear in mind that the car companies will choose suppliers and suppliers own sub-suppliers for a particular part, for a particular car, for the life of that vehicle program. You don't change suppliers generally during a vehicle life. And then when you start looking at it from a point of view of a complex part, if we take an airbag, for example, that airbag that goes off in the event of a crash to look after you consists of a huge number of parts. There are a very complex supply chain behind it. So, you know, an airbag starts with yarn that's woven into fabric, which has to be cut and sewn to the right shape, shipped to the airbag module assembler, which has to put that into a housing, which is probably made of metal. It could be made of plastic. It will then be added to, you'll have electronics, you'll have igniter, you'll have an inflator, you'll have explosive material in there, then there'll be a cover, and all that has to go into the car plant, or possibly to a seat plant first of all, to be fitted inside a seat. A breakdown in that supply chain for making that airbag could have a direct impact on whether you can actually make the car at the end of the day. And the same thing applies to other complex parts, whether it's a lighting assembly or a seat or a dashboard or of course an engine.
Well, let's get into a little bit more about some of the vehicle manufacturers and the supply chain side. So Ireland's supply chain has been quite disruptive in some of the software and services side, and also in some of the traditional sub-supply into tier ones, tier twos. If we start looking at some of those vehicle manufacturers where Irish suppliers have an interest or growth in there, let's start with JLR. How will Jaguar Land Rover be affected by Brexit? And what do you think are the opportunities for the Irish supply chain going forward?
How Brexit will affect JLR will depend on, again, as I said, the nature of the trade deal. If there are tariffs applied on components and on finished vehicles, JLR, based on recent production volumes, will have a tariff cost of 800 million to £1 billion a year, which, if you consider when it was making money, it was making about £1.25 to £1.5 billion a year. It's not an attractive position for the company. It's now loss-making, so it's doubly unattractive. That said, it is committing significant sums of money for it to making electric vehicles in the UK, and it will be looking to source a large number of parts for its electric vehicles, for the batteries and motors within the UK, ideally, in order to boost local content, and that could create some opportunity for Irish suppliers.
Let's explore that conversation a little bit more. So Tata is the parent company owning JLR, and there's been some conversation in the news about BMW getting involved with the EV, the disruptive tech platforms within JLR. How does that connect together, bearing in mind you've got the I-Pace, the E-Pace, which is in Magna, Austria. How does that all bed together?
Well, you've got to unpack those issues because actually they're not directly interlinked. First of all, Tata is obviously the parent company, but it focuses on commercial vehicles, trucks and light trucks in India primarily. Quite a separate business market to Jaguar Land Rover. There's very little technology transfer from Tata into JLR. You may get some the other way, but they're run as separate businesses by and large, other than a little bit of shared production for some JLR models in India. They're quite separate. And I think that will remain the case. In terms of the vehicles which are made in Austria, those are contract arrangements that will run for the life of the vehicle program. I think if JLR had its time again, it probably would decide to make the E-Pace here in the UK. At the time the decision was made to put it into Austria, it didn't have spare capacity in the UK. Now it very certainly does, and it could have made them in the UK more profitably than it does in Austria. But they will run for the life of the model. I don't think any new vehicles will be given to Magna going forward.
Let's turn our attentions to another automotive giant, VW Group. Has it really recovered from the Dieselgate?
VW certainly have hit financially very hard by the diesel scandal, and every time I think they've finally solved that problem, another case emerges, whether in the States or indeed in Europe. So I don't think we can say that the costs of that have been entirely sorted out. But nonetheless, VW is committing substantial sums of money, 70 billion euros or more maybe, to EV production, development and production worldwide. A lot of that is going to be in China as well as in Germany, but they'll also make EVs in the USA. And those will create some opportunities for Irish suppliers, whether of software-related products or physical products. I think for an Irish supplier, whether it's to JLR or Volkswagen or indeed from Mercedes, for example, supplying software and services from Ireland is a practical proposition. You may need some support activity in Germany to do that. Supplying physical product from Ireland into Germany may be more of a challenge because of the logistics of getting stuff from Ireland through the UK and then again into Europe. Post-Brexit, you could have all sorts of customs challenges there. So I think you need to differentiate between hard physical product and services. I think for services and software support, then I think there are almost certainly major opportunities for Irish companies.
I mean, so just rewinding a little bit there, we've talked about this 70 billion investment with VW Group, and Jaguar Land Rover has made a significant investment, certainly in Ireland with the autonomous, the software division there out of Shannon. How do you see it? So 70 billion, Jaguar Land Rover 1.5 billion going forward around disruptive new vehicle tech. Are they really that different apart? Are they really? Well,
I mean, VW is a global company making more than 10, maybe 11 billion vehicles worldwide. JLR is a relatively a minnow. It doesn't even make 600,000 vehicles a year, certainly not in Europe. So you can't compare them directly. So, and one of the reasons behind the decision of JLR to begin to partner a little bit with BMW is to share some technologies that it can't fully develop on its own. So there's a logical thing there. Of course, there is the added irony, in fact, that BMW used to own Jaguar Land Rover, then sold it, and may end up taking a greater involvement with it in the future.
Let's turn our attention to another German manufacturer, Mercedes. Where do they stand? Are they really leaders or followers in new vehicle tech and growth?
I think it's unfair to compare them directly in that sense, or say one is a leader or a follower, because they're all the German car companies, whether it's Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW, they're all moving in the same direction. They're all investing heavily in electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, and depending on when they launch a new vehicle or other, one or other, there's going to be an apparent leadership because your newest vehicle is always your most advanced. So it's a matter of what point in time you measure that. But they're all moving in the same direction. They're all investing heavily in electric vehicles. Mercedes, I think, 55 billion versus the 70 billion at the Volkswagen Group. And they're all building their own battery plants or investing with suppliers in Europe to build batteries, and the same with motors. So they're all moving in the same sort of direction.
Talking about alliances, let's come to the Renault-Nissan alliance. A lot of things in the news recently about their ex-CEO, Carlos Ghosn. How's that affair affected the alliance?
Well, I think it's had a fundamental effect on it. I think if Ghosn had stayed in charge, then I think you would have seen the two companies become much closer together. There are some people who think that Nissan engineered the arrest and so forth in order to get out of that closer alliance. And I think, again, had he remained in charge, you would probably have seen some Nissan vehicles made in Renault plants in Europe, and possibly vice versa. You may even have seen Renaults made in the UK at some point in order to balance production capacity and utilisation. That isn't going to happen now, and I think if we're now at a stage where, although they may share technologies behind the scenes, they are going to differentiate themselves a little bit more going forward.
So we've seen in the 80s that the Japanese assembly manufacturing plants have set up. So with Nissan's footprint, that make the Qashqai, the Juke and the new Leaf platforms. How do you see things going forward with Nissan in the future? Certainly from an Irish supply chain, that's significant volume in the UK, and long may that continue, and they can work within. How do you see that going forward?
Well, Nissan just recently confirmed the long assumed decision that they would indeed make the brand new Qashqai in the UK. They've been investing several hundred million to do so. That will start in September or October this year. They are 6 months or so into the production of the new Juke, and the Leaf is perhaps a year and a bit old. So you've got two very new and one imminently brand new vehicle program. Remember that vehicles last for 5 to 7 years, so one would therefore expect, all being well, UK production to continue into the mid-2020s before you see a major change. Of course, that is contingent upon a workable trade deal being agreed to between the UK and the EU. Nissan has repeatedly said that tariffs would undermine its business model. I don't think we would see tariffs leading to immediate disinvestment in the UK, but it would lead to a much more difficult environment for continued operation in the UK. But if we get a trade deal of some shape or form, then I think the prospects are quite good, and for Irish suppliers they should be good.
Today we've talked about 4 global vehicle manufacturers within the UK. Of course, there's many more than just 4. We've talked about the ones where Irish supply chains are particularly active or have any interest in being active in there. But of course, there's a number of other vehicle manufacturers, niche vehicle manufacturers, not to mention the off-highway, the diggers, the construction machinery side. How do you see the future of automotive going forward in the UK? Well,
I mean, last year the UK made about 1.36 cars and vans in the UK. That's down from nearly 1.6 a year ago, and at 1.7 back in 2017. I think this year the best we could hope for is pretty much the same. You might get a little bit of pull forward production into late 2020 if there's going to be a breakdown in trade negotiations. Breakdown in trade negotiations could see UK production begin to fall dramatically next year and thereafter, down to as little as a million vehicles a year if there's a breakdown in trade negotiations. If there's some sort of trade deal, then I think UK production should continue at roughly its current levels, with some fluctuation depending on when new models come in or go out. But a breakdown in trade negotiations could lead to car companies reassessing their production strategies for the UK, and you could see production volumes falling towards a million rather, and much lower if there's a complete breakdown in trade negotiations.
Ian Henry, Auto Analysis, thank you very much. It's been fascinating. Thank you.